This evening is an evening with Oliver Ressler, who is part of the exhibition with an artwork downstairs, and Başak Şenova, curator. Just a very brief introduction. When I thought about Oliver, your work, actually, I thought about it, that for me, coming of age as an art historian in the 90s in Vienna, actually, I have to say that your work, and then I was politicized by student protests, and then there was Schwarz-Blau around the 2000s. And I have to say that actually your work somehow was kind of the reference for me then at that point, or even something like an introduction to the idea of engaged political art. I remember that quite well, that I always used it when I was trying to teach also then to other people, maybe the idea that art could be a political one, that I showed your work, yours and Martin Kren's work at that time, quite often. So the keywords were somehow reclaiming the public space, then the idea that politics operate on a discursive level, so that language is part of it, and that it's not only action and socially interactive art, but it's also like this working on the image and language level, and the idea that artworks use a lot of text, and that you have a lot to read when you go in, but also that research is a very important foundation of doing art. These were things that I learned there. Then, of course, the topics of migration and border regimes, and that powerful structures. Actually, at one point, this was to be understood. There is that it's not only individual people doing things, but it's that powerful globalized structures going on that only for which that can only be counted well when it's collective action on the other side. So this is what were the lessons for me in my formation as an engaged art historian, I would say, and educator. You had a lot of solo exhibitions internationally, Sevilla, Lentos, Linz, Bucharest, Istanbul, and of course participated a lot in group exhibitions and biennials, and at Documenta Kassel in 2017. And currently, but we might hear about that maybe later, also you're curating or also leading a research project barricading the ice sheets on the climate justice movement, which is funded by the Austrian Science Fund. But I think we will hear maybe about that more later. Başak is a curator and designer. Currently, she is in Vienna because she is a visiting professor at the University of Applied Arts. She is the Turkish correspondent of Flash Art International and a member of the editorial board of PAS, International Biennial Association's Journal. She was advisory board member of the Turkish Pavilion in Venice Biennial, the Istanbul Biennial, and the Biennial of Contemporary Art in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you curated the Turkey and North Macedonia pavilions at the Venice Biennial in 2009 and 2015. Okay, I'm very much looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you very much. Before I start, just one warning. This is the first time I'm testing this. So during the talk, I may do some idiotic moves or gestures, so mind me. This is the first thing, because I keep, hitting myself. And of course, secondly, I really would like to thank a lot to Kunsthalle Wien and Wehave, Andrea, Oliver for really coming up with this idea, let's have a talk together, because it's a huge pleasure to be on the same platform with Oliver, who is a very important artist for me since the first time I discovered him. It was 2003, it was in Graz. Your installation was part of a public art exhibition, Utopia, or how was it, none? Yes, and I told you, yeah. So after this point on, I tried to create some opportunities to work with him, to follow him. So I mean, I can say two of them. One of them is in 2010, I invited Oliver to Istanbul, and he gave an amazing talk about democracy now. It was the name of the talk, I remember. And it was resonating so well with the, at that moment, and even now, of course, the political movements and what is ever happening there. And you were also having a talk together with Daniel Garcia Antujar, who is a Catalan artist, and he also had an exhibition at that time, Post-Capital Archive. So we've been talking a lot about democracy, we've been talking a lot about the flows of capital and so forth. Then I'm moving to 2014. You were already working on a very long and long trajectory project at that time about utopia with research exhibitions, but I also invited you to photography biennial in Helsinki. And at that time, the biennial's thematic, or let's say concept, was ecological policies, but it was really all about trying to understand the mechanisms behind the ecological catastrophes rather than illustrating them. And it was all about really trying to understand the mechanisms behind that. And I think what Oliver started to do from this point on, or you even started in 2008, I think, with climate crisis projects. Am I wrong?
I started already a bit earlier with it, but in 2008 it took a certain shift because I started to focus on the climate justice movement.
Okay, sorry. So anyway, we screened one of his works, and it was also about global warming. And I don't want to go into how I know him and how I admire his work and so forth. It can take ages. But I really would like to dive into our talk immediately, starting from the works that you are showing here. And by doing so, first of all, I want to do it in a very structured way. I want to ask him one by one, to describe a little bit describe a little bit and to give some ideas about the conditions and about the situations of this each film or video, but also doing it by navigating through your famous 3 questions that you posed. So these questions are on the table, but maybe it's good that we can also repeat them, or you can also just navigate through them while you're explaining. Maybe we can start with Paris in 2015, and I give the stage to you.
Okay, yeah, first thanks for accepting the invitation and thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure. Yeah, this is a project, everything's coming together while everything's falling apart. I started to work on with the COP21 in Paris in December 2015, and it's a cycle of films on events on the climate justice movement, and all of these are events of mass civil disobedience. So it's all events that consciously are against the existing law in the nation states where the events take place. And yeah, the reason is that after 21 years of negotiations, if we refer it to Paris, if we look at it nowadays, it's already 26 years of negotiations under the framework of the United Nations. We still have carbon emissions that still increase and did not decrease. And therefore, the hope many people have in the system of negotiations under the framework of the United Nations, and the belief that our people that work in the parliaments and in the governments that are meant to represent us, that they will kind of solve it is not very likely, so to say. So therefore, many people, millions of people, are in the opinion, and I share this opinion, that you need to act directly and just destruct certain destructive infrastructure or show certain things how they should be different. So in Paris, the film took place in a setting where the demonstration was just, I think, 2 or 3 weeks after this terror attack in the nightclub in Paris. And the government used this to have a state of emergency where the right to demonstrate was banned. While at the same time the Christmas markets were still open and the large shopping malls as well. So you can already see that a reason to ban demonstrations is not only a security measure, but it always says something about who is in power and what are the political wishes of the group that is in power. The government in Paris wanted to represent themselves as those who are able to tackle global warming and to deal with this, with the climate crisis. And they didn't want to have a huge opposition in the city against this method and against this way of negotiation that has been described also by many people, that it's a bit like also a trade fair, because also the largest polluters were part in the negotiations, which is of course a very strange situation. And so usually I show up in these events with a camera, sometimes with a team, sometimes on my own. In this case, it was on my own, and try to document whatever I'm able to document or think that might be interesting. And then the film, when I decide to do one, is being developed more or less in the weeks and months that follow in the studio, when I try to find a narration and when I assemble the material and work together with a musician and more like this. So
I want to continue with the other films as well, but I want to ask immediately a few questions here. One of them is, you started to talk about it a bit, about your artistic methodology, because this is so interesting for me, like how you are, how do you say, participating in all these protests and also in all these movements, because I see it not only as going there and keeping your distance and documenting, but I feel and I see that you are participating as well. So I really would like to talk a little bit about your position, and that also corresponds with one of these questions, because like one of the questions that you were asking is, I hope I have them here. No, I don't have them here, so I can read it. The role of the artist, basically. Like, okay, they're all in German, so this is English there, but basically one of the questions that he was posing is, what is the role of the artist within this climate movements? And not only with the climate movements, but also what is the responsibility of the artist with all these climate urgencies at this very moment? And merging it together with my question, so I really would like to hear from you about your position. Yeah.
It's a huge question. We could talk for a very long time. No, but I've been working on forms of resistance and on social movements for quite a bit of time. And usually I focus on social movements where I share the major aims of these movements. So to some extent, when I work on films, they have different functions, but one of these functions might be to kind of amplify certain ideas that exist in such a movement, or to highlight certain forms and tactics of civil disobedience, show blockades or sabotage or whatever. And in this particular case, it was very interesting to see also that the largest demonstrations that took place within Paris were actually co-organized by an art collective. And it's an art collective I'm in touch with. It's primarily two people, John Jordan and Isabelle Frémaux. And so they work together with different protagonists, local and international, and try to create a certain choreography also of the protest. So this idea with the red line leading from the Arc de Triomphe to this La Défense arc was more or less part of their choreography together with many other things. So for me, that was also the first time that I focused on different strategies that did not solely come from social movements in general or different groups, but there were already very directly artists involved with it. So the three questions, which are also here in the table, they actually come from a book I edited and that just was just published at the beginning of this year in the edition of the Camera Austria. It's called Barricading the Ice Sheets. Artists and climate activists in the age of irreversible decision. And this one question is on the role of artists in the movements, and these were actually also the questions I asked the people I invited to write contributions for this book. And I would not like to answer now with these people, but more or less with my own ideas that might also be different. And I see a big variety of different, very needed functions of artists in the social movements. So I think on the one hand, I think there is a very important function of people who provide certain tools of tactics that are being used within the activities. One of them, and there's a image in the book, is from, for example, from Arthur van Baarle. So he's an artist who created these inflatable cubes, and these cubes, they are silver, and they are being used in the blockades and in the demonstrations. And usually when you see them, they appear kind of playful, and they are also being used, so they are larger than a standing tall person, and they are just thrown in between people, and it seems to be a lot of fun behind playing with these inflatable cubes. But they have the function, for example, as soon as there is a confrontation with the police, then these cubes are being put in between the activists and the police, so they can also protect the participants in the movement against violence committed by the police. There is a function, of course, to produce all kinds of visual materials, PR materials for the movement. I would say that this is kind of the oldest function, and also in other movements, I think this is usually where artists are being involved the most. But I think in the recent years it could also be observed that in addition to this, many other tasks are being taken by artists. There are certain art collectives, like, for example, the Natural History Museum, which is not a museum, but it's a kind of an art collective that uses the label of a museum in order to carry out certain strategies where they collaborate with different, primarily indigenous movements and indigenous individuals in order to amplify their voices, and where they try to create a situation where they establish a museum as they want a museum to look like, which is very different to the kind of primarily natural museums you have around today in the US. And they are working primarily in a US context where the natural history museums are all funded very often from climate denial. So the Koch brothers, for example, were major funders of the largest natural history museums in the US. And through this funding, they also kind of change also the way of how certain issues like the climate crisis are represented in a scientific context. And yeah, I could continue. I mean,
No, I want you to continue as well, but let's, how do you say, I want to be loyal to the exhibition as well. So I want to move to 2016, the coal field at, where was it? Lusatia. So, and then you can maybe name them a bit, like new airport, and then the coal port at Amsterdam and so forth, because what fascinates me also, the diversity of them. So they're really different protests and different, let's say, movements. But, I mean, I have a lot of questions about their relationship. I have a lot of questions about their organizational structure and so forth. So if you can also, I'm so sure that most of you saw the films already, but if you can make the audience a little bit mentally visiting them again, I'll be really glad. Then we continue from there.
okay, so I try to give a quick overview about what can be seen in the 6 films. So first is the film on the Paris demonstrations. The second one was carried out in 2016, and it's a film on the second Ende Gelände action. Ende Gelände is a German collective. In this second action that I document, there were 4,000 participants, and they blocked a very big coal lignite open pit mine in the Lausitz, 1.5 hours south of Berlin. And it's one of the largest carbon sources in Europe, not only in Germany. And the number 3 is the ZAT. The ZAT is an area where the French government was planning to have a new airport for the city of Nantes. This goes back already like 30 or 40 years, and there was always a huge local resistance against this new airport. Around, I think, 2008, there was a climate camp in the area there, and lots of people realized that there are many empty farms, and the reason is that the government wanted to buy the farms there in order to build the airport there, but some farmers did not want to sell, and so this was a process that was taking like 10 years or so to buy up the farms there. And so many of these climate activists said, wow, that would be great to squat all these farms, and actually this is what very soon afterwards happened, and then more and more people moved there to these 3 houses in a very beautiful environment. And at the time when I was shooting there in 2017, there were like 500 or 600 people permanently living there, and more people staying there for a limited period, for a few weeks maybe per year. And yeah, the police tried several times to evict this ZAT there. They call themselves Zatistas, referring to the Zapatistas in Chiapas in Mexico and to their struggle that started in 1994. And yeah, this film is also different to the other ones because this did not, at the time when I was shooting there, not happen directly in an event of civil disobedience, but it was actually summertime with super nice weather, and so we just had a conversation with 5 people who permanently lived there, and I was raising a few questions about the history of the struggle, what it is at the moment, and what they expect from the future. And along these lines, the people were talking with each other, and I was documenting this for the camera and built the film and the narration on the base of this conversation. Then the 4th film is actually an activity against the 2nd largest coal harbor, which is located in Amsterdam, and it's a tactic comparable to the Ende Gelände tactic in Germany, and I think it was a quite successful thing as well. So the huge cranes and the loading facilities were blocked for one day, and there was a lot of public also, and it was in all the news locally. The 3rd film was the only one where I did not really plan to do a film, but somehow it happened. So in one of the climate camps in the Czech Republic, I was invited to go there and to involve in the camp, and I stood there for a while, and I took a camera with me and was planning to do a couple of images, but finally I ended doing a film. It was again a blockade of an lignite open pit mine. There was a lot of militarized police, also police on horses and on motorcycles, and they were quite cruel and quite violent. So there were several people with broken limbs and broken arms and things like that. And kind of interesting was also that they arrested most of the people who participated in it, and I was one of the arrested people, but for some reason they did not take away my camera. So I was also able to film from inside of this police truck, and I felt this is maybe a perspective I did not have in the other films, and therefore I decided to produce a very small film based on this thing. And as I didn't carry out any interviews or things like that, I built this film around a text with a fictional narrator, but all the information that was in the film was actually conversations I had with protesters, and I merged them together into one character, so to say. And the 6th and last film of this cycle, which I plan to see as a completed cycle, is on the Venice climate camp. That was actually, so to say, a commissioned piece by the Venice climate camp. The people who organized it wanted me very much to go there, and there were a few different actions. Not all of them worked. I built my film more or less around action that I think worked quite nicely, and that was the blockade of the red carpet of the Venice Film Festival that took place at the same time. And this was a very smart and actually very easy idea, I think, from which really movements internationally can also learn a lot, because this was even an announced event. It was announced that at 4 p.m. the red carpet of the Venice Film Festival would be blocked by the climate activists. There were billboards all around the city, and this billboard can also be seen in my film. And then we decided to make it slightly different. We showed already up at 4 a.m., not p.m., and it was actually much easier because there were only a few security guards and one police van, and we more or less ran through the security lines, and Yeah, and had a very joyful day there. I think the occupation lasted 7 hours, and all the international media, from CNN to BBC and all the Italian networks, Al Jazeera, US networks, were there in order to prepare for the film festival stars to move on the red carpet. So this was something where I think we were in the morning news at 7 a.m. on CNN, right? I think it was my first participation in such an action where I was more or less live on CNN.
Okay. I lived it again. So one of the questions I want to pose immediately is about all of these cases that you're talking about, movements, are their own individual movements indeed, no? Like, so my question is more about how much they are informed about each other, or do they ever collaborate, or do they ever communicate, or do they ever exchange, for instance, data or anything as such?
So all these 4 events I focused on took place in Europe. This is nothing that was planned from the beginning, but I found it quite interesting also to focus on what is more or less in a bit of a proximity, right? To I think all of the events I could also go by train and not fly, and so it was more or less I could reach all the destinations within a 12-hour trip, and I had the impression, and I know also that there is a lot of exchange in between the different groups in the different countries. So you see in the actions in the Czech Republic or in the Netherlands, activists from Ende Gelände participating. I think the activists from the Czech Republic and the Netherlands participated first in the events of Ende Gelände, also learned from these events there. So right at the moment while we are speaking, there is a new mobilization here in Vienna for the coming Ende Gelände blockade of a lignite coal mine in Germany. They use, by the way, my film on Ende Gelände for this mobilization. It's taking place right now at the same time. So the Austrian activists here, the movement is unfortunately a bit weaker, but they participate a lot in Germany, and I think usually there are like 2, 3, or 4 buses of people who participate in the large Ende Gelände events. So I think there's quite an exchange, and the actions and activities are being discussed and among these groups. And I think also films, like I'm doing this, but also other people are doing films, they also are important in this context, as these are actions that also exist because they create a very strong visual imagery. And I think this strength of the visual aspect is also one of the reasons of their success, because you can also get big media to write about it with such strong imagery, and then you can at least try to also get some of your political agenda within the mainstream media as an activist or as an organization.
I want to go back, I want to take one step back again and tackle a little bit about your first question. So I also would like to ask you, what do you think about the distinction between individual responsibilities, and the collectivities? Like, how do you see the distinction, or do you see a distinction?
Yeah, also my opinion towards this question also changed over the years, because like when I started to work on this field in the mid-1990s, I would have been in the opinion that we need to target the transnational corporations and we need to push governments in order to introduce the required legislation in order to secure the survival of humanity. And I mean, now so many time was also lost because of unsuccessful negotiations. Now we are real in a climate emergency, and the thing is very time sensitive. So I think now we need both. So we need a lot of personal commitment, and in addition, the expropriation of the transnational corporation and the right legislation in order to get an ecological and economic transition that brings us in the direction of decarbonization and climate justice. So it has to go hand in hand with a real redistribution of wealth and power also towards the global south. The people there will also be the most affected and are already the most affected at the moment, right? Yeah, so I think there's an individual responsibility and a social responsibility, and I think if we really want to achieve social change, I think as individuals we need to organize within social movements, because I think that these are the main protagonists from whom we can expect that they can push towards the required political change. So it won't come from within parliaments, for sure not. So, and it won't come from within negotiations within the United Nations. So there was time enough to see if this is possible. So I didn't believe it would work 20 years ago, but there were some people who said we have to give them time and we have to lobby and we need to convince them. It's not about convincing, it's not about knowledge, it's simply about political power. And we need to shift that the political power changes in a way that the social movements get a kind of a strength that they cannot be overlooked anymore, right?
It's corresponding with your, one of the, okay, I cannot open this, my God. One of the questions, so, like, let me read the question. I'll be okay. I couldn't open it, I'm sorry. Like, I'm a bad, like, sci-fi movie here. This is how I feel. I'm sorry. Okay. So your question is, corporate polluters use sophisticated strategies to make their pollution, emissions, and responsibility invisible. The production of invisibility is concerted and formidable. What artistic strategies might disrupt this gigantic manufacture of opacity? So I think this is what we are basically talking, I mean, this is what you are basically talking at this very moment, but it also brings another question to my mind, like it's about the responsibility of the institutions. But also, I'm also thinking in a very interesting way, we're all talking about these movements that are totally self-organized. And when I'm thinking about institutions that are not really self-organized, there is also this, yes, there must be and there are deep connections and support or solidarity, but at the same time, there should be some tensions as well. So, yeah.
I'm not sure if it directly connects to the question. I mean, I focus primarily on what I label as social movements, and by definition, these are non-hierarchical movements. It's leaderless movements, right? So, to some extent, I think the way of how such movements organize, it's kind of prefigurative politics, so it already points towards a direction of what I expect, of what I hope, or which would be also an important aspect of how a future society could be organized around, right? So there must be much more self-organization, I think, self-management, and much less representation, right? I think this belief that it's possible that like all 4 years you go to elections and then people will make decisions on your behalf, this is the main reason why we are in such troubles now, right? Because there are all ways of intervening, of influencing, of lobbying, and there's big money involved. So I think if we are up to design a future form of organizing democracy and to really come to a stage where we can say that we live in a democracy or we are on the way to a democracy, then the self-organization and self-management must be much more central, and it must not stop from the field of the economy, right? So that's one of the really crazy things, is that most people think they live in a democracy, but like 8 or 9 hours per day, they live in a kind of dictatorship because there's a boss and this person says what to do and what not to do. So I think this is something that also structurally has to be dissolved. And there are numerous examples all around the world, right? Around 2005, I focused on self-managed factories in Latin America in collaboration with Dario Azzolini. But nowadays, it's also an effect of the economic crisis of 2008. You also find self-managed factories all across Europe, right? I'm not saying that they work so well. I mean, also because they have to compete with other companies that are run under capitalist circumstances. But in general, I think these are really important structures to look at, and where you really can learn a lot about the capacity of people to really come together, to make decisions together, to run in an egalitarian way businesses where several hundred people can also be employed there, right? In Latin America, you have factories with 2,000 or 3,000 people.
But now I have another question, really a little bit the other side of the coin, kind of. Like, I also wonder, because you are, I know that you're studying and you're really researching a lot about each and every organizations and also the infrastructure and how they're coming together or how they're operating in its own, for each and every case. But then, I wonder about the critical stance that you have towards any of those movements, like, meaning that, like, there must be a lot of things that you should be also saying that it's not right how they're managing, it's not right how they're approaching. So my question, is there any kind of space for this kind of discussion with them?
I think there are numerous spaces, and to some extent I also try to create the space. So I organized a symposium in the Camera Austria in February this year, and I invited 5 different activists who all come from an artist background, and they all came from very different parts in the movement, right? And so the conference, it's a 2-day conference. It was fully documented, and you can also find it now on my Vimeo account. So you can watch it. But I think a huge part of the conference was also kind of of a bit of a struggle in between different fractions of the movements, right? So I would say the most visible disagreement within the movement at the moment is there is the more leftist, self-organized movements I also focus on in this cycle of films. You can see here in the exhibition. And then, I think it was in 2018, Extinction Rebellion started with the blockade of 4 major bridges in London. And the blockade lasted for a couple of days, and it was very successful because it was really there in all the media, and finally the UK was the first country in the European Union that declared a climate emergency. In the meantime, there are more governments, even the Austrian government declared a climate emergency. But I mean, the way how the Extinction Rebellion operate, how they talk to the media, and also some of their principles are highly problematic for many participants in the movement, including myself. To have a movement and to not to say you're left or right or liberal or anarchist or whatever, is, I think, not so good, because you open up the doors for all kinds of right-wing assholes and people you don't want to have in a self-organized movement, right? So I think you also need to have certain parameters that really make a clear line, or to say, well, I don't know, yeah, we don't want to have racism, we don't want to have sexism, we don't want to have homophobia and things like that within our movements, right? And I'm not saying that all of this is accepted within Extinction Rebellions, but there are very problematic parts in some countries, right? It's always a bit complicated to talk about Extinction Rebellion in general, because the different factions in the different countries are also quite different from each other.
Okay, I would like to ask my last question. I want to contain myself. I have hundreds, but so that we can open our talk to the public, our public, so that we can have some questions from them as well. So my last question is about context. I know that apart from the art context, you're also showing these films and your work in different contexts. And for instance, in some of the movements, or also some other alternative spaces. Can you elaborate on this a bit? Then I'm done.
Yeah, I mean, I come from an art background, and for me it was always important to present work and produce work that is being produced in the art world, also just because I think it's an amazing space that leaves you so many possibilities to work there, and to also try out different formats, and there's in relation to other spaces almost no censorship, so you can also really articulate how you feel it's right. And on the same time, while I love the art space and will for sure continue to work in the art space, I always had a feeling we have to go beyond it. So that's why in the 1990s I did lots of projects in public space, because I tried to find a wider or a more diverse audience. And in the year 2000, I started to work with film, and the main reason why I started to film was the same reason, because I wanted to have a medium which I can also use beyond the confines of the art space. So yeah, and the films were actually the kind of work that enables me to really be present in a multiplicity of different spaces. So the films can be used by movements, by political organizations, by unions, and they are used. Not all of them, but many of them. And some of them also are being presented in film festivals. I have a conversation on Via tomorrow for the Leiden International Film Festival, where my new film Carbon and Captivity will be presented, for example. So it's different contexts, and yeah, it's also quite a luxury for me just to experience also the different reactions of the different contexts, because you can also have very different questions depending on if you get questions in an art context, in an activist context, or in a film festival context. But also within the art context, you can have so many different fields of the art context, right? It's a huge difference, I think, if you show in an alternative space, in a non-profit space, or in a large museum where maybe pupils also go there and yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I want to ask, do you have any questions?
Phone. Also, Flora, genau, ja. So. You're leaving, okay.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was very inspiring. I was very interested in one thing you talked a lot about. You very often mentioned you evaluated if something was successful, right? So the self-organized factories, the different actions. And I was wondering what you would say when you do something. When do you say this was successful?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you. I don't have an easy answer for that. It's probably different things, and in only very few of them, I think all of these criteria would come together. So maybe I never did a successful work so far. So, I mean, on the one hand, there is a success that when you present a film to an audience, and when you see that the audience is really interested in it, that it creates for them a kind of a space of imagination, and where they get then inspired to do something, and that it opens up their mindset and things like that. So then I think you manage to get a success. Of course, there's something like, I don't know, a success in to have media coverage. Here I realized that probably the most successful things, if I just take the number of reviews or so, are probably also the most easy and simplest works. So probably none of the 34 films I did in the last 20 years was then so successful under these criteria, because the most successful are those where the media find a way to kind of scandalize the content, right? And a film is too complicated as a source for a scandal. I'm not saying that it does not happen, but at least in my case, it did not happen really. So that's very often the one image that you can understand in 1 minute, and that also when it's printed in a newspaper, the reader can understand within a few seconds. So I had a censorship and a scandal case just a few weeks ago in Norway, in Tromsø, where I had something I described as an oil spill flag. It was a project that is in front of the local Kunsthall in Tromsø, so this country in the very north of Norway, and they have a project that goes back already 5 years. So they have a flagpole in front of the art institution, and give the flagpole to one artist for 1 month to design one flag. And I came up with the idea to use the flag for a Norwegian flag. And I created an imagery that looks as if the flag, as if there would be an oil spill, right? And knowing that the vast majority of the gross domestic product in Norway is being made through the extraction of petroleum, this is of course something that created kind of a controversy locally, and the flag was stolen twice. and different things happened you could not imagine. So success, yeah, but I mean, there's also a success in the sense that that you get an audience within an activist field or within an art field, and create certain visibility with your piece, or that you maybe can generate certain discussions or facilitate certain discussions through your work. Or sometimes success is just, for me also, that you have someone in the audience whom you adore, and this also can really give you a lot. David Graeber just died a few days ago, which I think was a very sad thing. And for me, it was maybe one of my best, what I would consider a success, that he was in the audience in a talk I gave in the Tate 2 or 3 years ago in London, and just that he was there was really fantastic for me, and I felt great like 3 days afterwards.
I've got a question concerning the temporalities you were mentioning earlier, which was actually connected to the question, what do you think about individual responsibilities and collective responsibilities? And you were saying actually it's already too late. So I'm wondering, the movements, do they sometimes think like blockades are not necessarily the right strategy anymore? I mean, we have to speed up in a way. I remember we had a talk and I asked you, why don't they do more radical stuff, you know, like really, you know, like crashing the system? I mean, is there a debate within the movements? Like, are we too slow? You know, in a way, it feels speeding up. I mean, accelerating is a big, important thing to do right now.
Yeah. Thanks for this question. I think that many people involved in the climate justice movement have the feeling that we have to go beyond, we have to grow faster, we have to become quicker, we have to become more influential, also because the thing we're talking about is so time sensitive, and every month, every year we lose creates a catastrophe for so many people, and diminishes our chance to have a planet on which we still can live, like in 50 years, 100 years. And I think, like, the climate justice movement as we see it nowadays started more or less in Europe around 2007, 2008, I would say. So these were events, bigger events, that went beyond demonstrating on the street. Till then, it was primarily having a demonstration and that's it. At that time, people then felt that civil disobedience is probably a strategy we have to go. And I think as Ende Gelände designed the actions, they are kind of designed that you go beyond the existing law, but the risk you take, you take a lot of risk, but it's also kind of a calculated risk, right? And there are also certain precautions. For example, the people, they show up in white overalls, and to have these white overalls has different functions. On the one hand, you are in an area where there's extraction of coal, so there's dust, and you have also a dust mask, so it's good, it's self-protection. But on the other hand, you also create a certain identity as a group for a group action. And third is also that it hides you as an individual participant in an action. So it's also self-defense. There are certain methods that no one goes to these actions, or very few people go to these actions with a mobile phone or with an ID card. So there are some people in the camp or in other safe places who store all the mobile phones and ID places to make it safer to participate in the actions. These actions are designed in order to fit to existing laws in different states. In Germany, there is a law that the police cannot take you into prison for longer than 48 hours if there's not really a major crime involved, right? If you do not assassinate a person or really commit a major level of property damage that goes in the millions, after 48 hours you're free. If you don't tell your identity, police has more or less no chance to get your identity unless you give it to them for some particular reasons. The Extinction Rebellion in 2018 tried to go beyond this. So they took quite radical actions, and even in the very first statements, quite aggressively they stated, we will flood the prisons in the UK so they can arrest all of us, thousands of us, till the politics that are the right ones in a situation of a climate emergency are being introduced. So on the one hand, it's quite naive thing. I think that politics works like this. But on the other hand, there's also a big involvement of personal risk, right? And people were also standing there with their ID, saying their full name, saying, I stay till I will brought to prison, I will not move from this bridge, I will stay here forever in order to get this, this required change. But this risk, there's also quite a critique of it, right? Because you can only act like this if you are in a kind of a privileged situation. If you are white, if you are primarily male, and if you have an EU citizenship, you can take the risk. And I also think it might make sense in certain situations to take this risk. In a precarious situation, with no legal status, as a transgender person, I would not recommend to participate in this kind of activities, right?
Hi, I would also want to know more about your artistic practice, especially when it comes to you coming to a group, participating. In how far do you identify with the group? Thinking about the difference between the example you brought up with the airport in Nantes and in the Czech Republic. How do you identify? Are you the observer still there? Are you an activist? Do you switch? This balance between the artist and an activist, I'm interested if you can say something more about that.
Yeah, I think probably there is part of these two identities that kind of merges in my personality. I mean, I'm trained as an artist, and I did lots of work relating to activism and showing up several times or quite frequently in certain activist networks and events, then very often creates the impression, and there's probably some reason for it, that you're also being described as an activist as well. I myself didn't label myself as an activist for really many years, so I always felt that I'm not a neutral observer, I'm an observer who is very much committed to these things, but I'm also not really directly part of these movements. In numerous conversations I had showing primarily my films on these movements, very often people in the audience told me, if you do a film like this, then you are part of the movement. So there's no possibility to say you are not really part of the movement because you do not directly carry out the action, because there are so many different obligations, so many different tasks within a movement, right? You can also be part of the movement through being part of the cooking team, for example, and never participate in any of the actions of civil disobedience, just because also to provide food for the activists is a very important aspect, or to provide the child care for the parents who participate in the forms of civil disobedience. So I came to the conclusion that probably I'm also an activist for doing artistic work that has a specific meaning and function also within the activist world.
That was a beautiful, I think, closing sentence. Do you have any other questions? Because it was so beautiful. I don't want to, how do you say, spoil the poetic touch of it. No? Okay. Thank you so much. It was so much fun. And
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Başak.
Thank you.
For the great talk for this evening. Maybe I just use the time just to announce that there will be one more event in the end of September, so on the 30th of September and 1st of October, under the title of Touching the Elephant, Practices and Politics of Social Distancing. It will be 2 afternoons of talks here on the table, but they will be very much of an experiment also, because we will really work on how to practice conversation in times of a pandemic, and it will be a little bit more like maybe provocative in the setting and the possibilities of interactions and posing questions. There will be only a can phone, you know those phones where you have one can on the one side and there is a string and then a can on the other side. It will be the only way for you to pose questions. Let's try what that as an experiment on distance and proximity will bring us for conversations. So so hope to see you there. And then maybe just also for the record, I stop with 2 statements. Evacuate Moria, I would say, and we have space here. And the second one is right to vote to those who live here in Vienna.